Hello, and welcome back to Tranquility du Jour, nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life with doses of tranquility. This is episode 593. I'm your host, Kimberly Wilson, bringing you tranquility through this medium since 2005. Today, we're talking about how someday is today. And you're going to get lots and lots of really actionable, thoughtful, simple, but profound tips. So in today's episode, I'm chatting with Matthew Dix about his new book, Someday is Today, 22 Simple, Actionable Ways to Propel Your Creative Life. Now, I know a lot of you have creative dreams in mind, and sometimes it's hard to find the time and space in our busy, full lives. And so he is going to share many, many ways in which he puts it into his incredibly full life. So you're going to learn about his 100-year-old plan and how it can help us live without fear of regret, how to maximize task efficiency, his thoughts on social media, how he likes to sleep sacredly, and more. So definitely have a pen and paper nearby because I think you're going to want to take some notes. All right, a gentle reminder to please hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Amazon. And I have links to all of these in the show notes, which can be found at kimberlywilson.com/593. Also, be sure to head on over to kimberlywilson.com/podcast for more scoop on the podcast, including ways that you can leave a review. I love reading your reviews, and I so appreciate you taking the time to do so. Now, for anyone who is new to Tranquility du Jour, a big welcome, and you can learn more about the community at kimberlywilson.com/new. All right, a few things that are coming up that I would love to have you join me for is on November 14th. It is Hip Tranquil Chick, my very first book's Sweet 16 birthday party. So I can't believe she has turned 16. And when I realized it this summer, I was like, we must have an event. So it's a free event, and you will get a sweet little workbook, and it'll just be a fun evening together. Again, that's on the 14th. Link to sign up is in the show notes. Also, on December 12th is Tranquil Holidays Pop-Up. So this is where every year I give some tips on how to find more tranquility, or any tranquility actually, during the hectic holiday season. And it's also going to be a reveal of Coterie 2023. Would love to have you join. And then there's also a link to the Coterie Waitlist, which opens mid-December. And there's a link in the show notes for that. You can find out more about the Coterie at kimberlywilson.com/Coterie. All right, without further ado, our guest is Matthew Dix, and he's the author of Someday is Today and 9 other books. A best-selling novelist, nationally recognized storyteller, and award-winning elementary school teacher. He teaches storytelling and communications at universities, corporate workplaces, and community organizations. He's won multiple Moth Grand Slam story competitions and, together with his wife, created the organization Speak Up to help others share their story. They also co-host the Speak Up Storytelling podcast. He lives in Connecticut with his family. You can visit him at matthewdix.com. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to have you and to chat about Someday is Today. 22 simple, actionable ways to propel your creative life. Okay, who doesn't want that? So tell us about your journey to writing this. Like, what inspired this new book?
Oh, well, I stand in front of audiences a lot, as a novelist and a storyteller and just sort of a person who does a lot of public speaking. And when we get to that Q&A section of every talk, the first question I always get is, how do you do all the things that you do? I'm an elementary school teacher, and I write novels, and I run a couple businesses, and I storytell and perform on stages. And people just see that and they wonder, how does he manage to fit it into the day? And when I get that question, I always think, if you give me 18 hours, I'll sit down with you and I'll explain the whole the whole system, but no one, even my wife, no one wants 18 hours of me all in one gulp. So I often would give a couple ideas and always feel like I didn't really help them very much. So the book is sort of the answer to that question. So whenever someone asks me, how do you manage to do all that you do? I say, well, go buy the book and you'll have the answer and I'll be a little richer for it in the process and it'll be a win-win. So that's where the book really came from, the desire to answer that perpetual question.
Well, you know what I love too is in your bio, like, and I'm just going to read these pieces. Um, well, you actually have it in the description here, but I wear a lot of hats: author, as you just said, elementary school teacher, storyteller, consultant, speaking coach, minister, wedding DJ, not to mention father, cat owner, husband, poker player, and mediocre golfer, which I just thought that was amazing.
It's a lot,
It's a
it's
lot.
but I managed to fit it in and I always point out to people as much as they like to focus on sort of all the professional things that I do, I spend enormous amounts of time with my children and my wife and my friends and on the golf course. So, I try to push back on the idea that sort of I'm a workaholic or I'm productivity obsessed in an attempt to accomplish work goals, which to a degree I am, but a lot of it is so that I can clear the field so that when my son says, let's go outside and, punch each other, I say, yes, let's go out on the lawn and just beat each other up. And I'm always willing to do that. And there's plenty of time to do it because of the way I've structured my life.
I love it. I love that you have plenty of time for beating up. You know, makes me think of those is it James, who goes on the little trips to with the I'm not saying this correctly with the various musicians, and I don't know if you saw the one where he did it. Is it James? It starts with a C. I'm blanking on his last name, but he's very funny, British comedian. But he was on the lawn with like Anthony Kiedis and like the
Oh,
Red Hot Chili Peppers.
James Corden.
James Corden, yes. It
Yes.
was like
Yeah.
so funny. I'm like, who does that? Well, apparently
Uh-huh.
people do that.
Yeah, I mean, my wife watches my son and I. He's 10, and she just watches us like pull all the couches, all the cushions off the couch so that we can fight on the couch. And she just says, I don't understand why the two of you so enjoy like sitting on top of each other and banging on each other in the way that you do, but that's what we like.
It's a thing.
It is.
Now, you say that someday may be your least favorite word. And, I appreciate that, right? Because you say you've got time to do these various things, and yet you also focus on family. And so many people have in their minds, like, oh, someday I'll do that, or someday I'll write that novel, right? And so, what is it about the word that bothers you?
I think it's just an excuse for procrastination, and I think it inevitably leads to a lack of fulfillment. I think that what most people do in life tragically is they say that someday they're going to do this thing and then they run out of some days. And all you have to do is talk to hospice workers, which I've done,
Mhm.
and ask them what people talk about in the final days of their lives. And inevitably, it's about regret. And it is the regret of what they didn't do, the chances they didn't take, the romantic partner they didn't dare to ask out, the places they didn't go. So it is that idea that someday I'm going to get to the Grand Canyon. And then you run out of some days, or someday I'm going to write that book or build that business or solve that problem that I have the answer to. And someday is just an excuse to not do it until you can't do it anymore. So it's a killer word that just I think tragically leads to a lot of regret, and I hate that.
Well, and that leads me into the next question, right? As we talk about regret, is so the 100-year-old plan. I love this. And your idea behind that, at least what I understand in the book, is to help us not lead a life that ends in regret. So can you explain what this is?
Yeah, so it's sort of the fundamental philosophy that I operate my life under. When I was 22 years old, I was managing a McDonald's restaurant and I was robbed. After hours, the store was closed. Three men came in with guns, and there was a compartment in the safe where most of the money was located, and I couldn't open that compartment as one of those. The manager does not have the key, and the men with the guns didn't believe me, and so ultimately, after they beat me, they got me on the floor and they put a gun to my head and they said, "I'm going to count back from three, and if you don't open that compartment, we're going to kill you." And these were men who I knew had killed other people already. The police had come and warned me that there were these people robbing restaurants. And so as that man started counting back from three, I was absolutely certain that I was at the end of my life. I really, without a doubt, believed I was about to die. And the remarkable thing for me was in those final moments, I didn't feel anger or sad or even fear. The only feeling I was consumed with was regret. I'm a 22-year-old kid on a greasy tile floor about to die with a million dreams, and I had yet to pursue a single one of them. And
Mm.
so obviously I survived that night. There was no bullet in the gun. He pulled the trigger on an empty gun, which resulted in many years of trouble for me. But oddly, it gave me a glimpse into what most people have to be 85, 95, and 105 to feel, which is you're at the end of your life and you look back and realize you haven't used it in the way you should have.
Mm.
And so from that moment, I sort of created this mindset or this philosophy that when I'm stuck with a decision to make, typically about how am I going to spend my time, which direction am I going to take? Am I going to try to do this thing that seems hard or difficult or impossible? I don't rely on myself, the current version of me. I imagine the 100-year-old version of myself, the one lying in bed. He's got a few days left. He's finally watching some television. I ask that version of me, what should I do with, let's say, the next 2 hours of, I suddenly have 2 free hours. What should I do with it? That version of me never says binge a Netflix show. That version of me never says scroll through social media. Like these are not things that are ever suggested to me by that version of me. That version of me always says, write the book you're working on, go play with Charlie, go talk to your daughter, go hang out with your wife, try to improve your golf game, go for a bike ride, pet your cat, all of those things that we, you know, take for granted because we think we have some days. We think we have an endless number of days when truthfully, a bus can hit us tomorrow, and so that version of me, that 100-year-old version of me always makes the right decision. I think we just have to remember that. If I was to make a decision about how to spend today, in the current version of me, it would always be cheeseburgers and golf. Like that's what I would do. I would eat cheeseburgers and I would play golf and I'd punch my son, in a friendly way. But the 100-year-old version of me says there's nothing wrong with an occasional cheeseburger. And golf is great, especially when you're playing with friends or your family. But there's a multitude of other things you're hoping to accomplish with your life. And please don't forget those as well. So I just don't think we can trust ourselves. We're not reliable narrators in the moment. We have to be looking to the future and asking, what do we really want from our lives?
Well, it's funny too, that 100-year-old self would not be like, oh, yeah, scroll on Instagram for another hour. It's like,
Right.
it's funny, right? Our short term, like, gain, right? We're just like, oh, I just want this. I just want to be satisfied. It's never like, it's never a good use of time, which actually is an upcoming question. But I'm curious, overall, you've got this like maximizing, way of living your life and making sure you still have time for golf and family and cats. And so, what are some ways in which you really try to maximize your day? Like, are you like, I have a diehard morning routine and I go to bed at this time, or?
Well, I guess all of those things, sort of, and more. I think the thing I want people to understand or prioritize is time. The problem with the way we live is so many people think they can only accomplish tasks in 30 or 60-minute increments, or they need 3 hours to do something. When what is the truth of our lives is we often have like 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there and 6 minutes here. And those are the times that we dither away. That's when the most convenient thing for us to do, if we're waiting 10 minutes for something, is to take a phone out and look at something that's not going to make us feel good about ourselves, by the way. Like nothing on social media almost ever makes us feel good. And yet that is the most convenient thing for us to do. And so if we instead look at that 10-minute or that 6 minute or that 1 minute block that we have, and we say, oh, I got 1 minute, what are we going to do in the 1 minute? I never reach for the phone. I always keep a list of things in my head that I can be doing given the amount of time I have. So for example, you and I are talking, but I was here early, right? When you clicked on, I was already on the call, right? I was on the call and I had the book I'm writing up. And I knew I probably had somewhere between 1 to 6 minutes before your face was going to appear on the screen. And so I said to myself, well, let's see if I can write 3 sentences, because a book is, about 2,000 sentences. And if I write three, that gets me closer to the end of my book. Whereas most people think, well, I can only really write if I have an hour. and a coffee. And I have to be sitting in a Starbucks and I need smooth jazz, right? And I always remind those people that during World War I, there were men in trenches and gas masks. Artillery was exploding over their heads, and they had little notebooks and little pencils, and they were writing stories that they would hope to publish someday if they survived this battle and everyone that was going to happen after it. So if you think you need 3 hours and smooth jazz and a cappuccino, you've really done terrible disservice to yourself and dishonored everyone who came before you who did not have cappuccino and smooth jazz and a Starbucks. So we have to look at time as being exceptionally precious. So one of my favorite things to get people to do is make a list of everything you can do in 10 minutes, anything that you can actually accomplish in 10 minutes, so that you have that list, so that when my son is looking for his shoes, which are always in different rooms for some reason, and we're trying to get out the door, my wife will take out her phone and she'll start scrolling through something. But I will say to myself, well, the dishwasher needs to be emptied. Maybe I can get the top rack done now so that when I get home, I only have to do the bottom rack. And that gets me closer to something I actually want to be doing. So when we stop looking at tasks as they need to be completed as a whole, and we stop looking at time as 30-minute increments or 60-minute increments, but instead 1-minute increments, that's when we can really start maximizing our time.
You know what I really like about this is I remember I owned yoga studios for a while, and we had a little on cute little note cards, pastel note cards, like what to do when there's nothing to do, right? All these little things.
Yeah.
I've never thought of doing that for my personal life. And that makes so much sense. And I'm one of those, I need to have the perfect kind of experience, at least an hour, blah, blah, blah. And so that's why I was giggling. Because I'm like, does he know? But it's one of those things where it's like, one author talks about writing in the margins of your life, right? So as you're waiting to pick your kid up from soccer practice
Yeah.
or, what have you. And I was just like, oh my gosh, that's genius. I wish I could do that. So is there a secret? I love the example you gave of you had your document up and you were like, okay, I can type a few sentences. But how do we switch that from, I got to have the hour, I got to have the smooth jazz, perfect conditions before I can really do this?
Well, I mean, part of it tragically is you have to really maintain awareness of that 100-year-old self and the fact that, after we've gathered Charlie's shoes and we're walking out the door, the engine of a plane can fall out of the sky and hit me and end it all right now. Did I want to spend the last 4 minutes of my life scrolling through Twitter while waiting for my son to gather his shoes? It's a terrible way to live, but it's a good way to live when you're thinking about this day is precious and it might really be my last, because most people do not begin the day thinking it's their last, but we will all begin a day at some point in our life that will be our last. And most of the time we don't know. My wife's uncle passed away yesterday, unexpectedly. We did not anticipate it. He did not anticipate it. He woke up yesterday alive and did not finish the day alive. And that is the truth for most of us when we end our life. And so if we just think of it that way, which is morbid, but in the words of my wife, creates a relentlessness in you to make sure that you're not being foolish, that you're not dithering away the time. The problem is that in the last day of your life, minutes are going to be precious. If you know that this is the last day of my life, right? Every minute will be savored. But the problem is we don't know when our last day is. So we must savor all of our minutes, because the minute that we're having right now is just as precious as the minute in the last day of my life. So we have to treat them preciously, and we have to view it that way. And we have to let go of all the pretentiousness and preciousness of creation, that it requires certain things. My production manager, when she read my book, she said, the first thing that changed in my life is, she said, I used to start everything at the half hour, the quarter hour, or on the hour. If it was 11:20, she would wait till 11:30. She'd be like, all right, well, I'll get going at 11:30. She suddenly realized, why am I waiting until the half hour to start something? Why am I waiting till, well, I'll start dinner at 11:30, right? I'll start it at 11:20. What am I thinking? So we have to shift that mindset. And it's not easy, but, being aware of the preciousness of minutes, I think, is really important.
Yeah, it is. And I really like the examples because, I've even read how people will write, a book in a year by just getting up 15 minutes earlier every day.
Yeah.
So it's like, why aren't we doing this? Why do we feel as if like, oh, I mean, it is. It's just like it's a quick dopamine, right? You just scroll and then you're like, oh my gosh, like 30 minutes has gone by. I'll never get that time back.
Never. Yeah. Well, there's a principle of incrementalism that people sort of never really buy into, So anything that you want to achieve, a big goal, something important, it's probably 1,000 tiny steps. And the problem is most people want to think of things as enormous steps and big gulps and magic pills rather than those 1,000 tiny steps. So if we acknowledge that any kind of progress gets us closer to what we're shooting for, that can be really rewarding. The fact that I wrote 3 or 4 sentences before we began this interview makes me feel great because I'm 3 or 4 more sentences closer to the end. And if I can't write 3 or 4 sentences, because sort of the act of creation sometimes is challenging, I could at least go back to the paragraph I wrote this morning and say, well, I'll read that paragraph and see if that's a good paragraph. And if it's not, I'll revise it. And it comes to everything. I was consulting with someone the other day, and actually a vice president of a company. We were talking about achieving goals, and she said, for years I've been saying I want to have a vegetable garden in my backyard. And I said, well, why don't you have one? And she said, I don't know. I just keep saying it, but I'm not doing it. And I said, well, let's start right now. And she said, well, you're going to come over to my house in San Francisco? And I said, no, but it's 1,000 tiny steps to get to a vegetable garden. I think you need seeds, right? So let's buy some seeds right now. So she shared her screen with me. We went to Amazon and she bought seeds that are now going to arrive at her house on Monday. So she's taken the first step. And sometimes that first step can be enormous for someone because now you're staring at seeds and you realize I have seeds, right? And so the next thing we did was make a list of all the things you need to do to have a vegetable garden in your backyard. Because when you have a list, you can go, well, there's a bunch of things here that take 5 minutes. And there's a bunch of things here that are going to take an hour and a half. But in those 5 minute increments you have, can you then go look for like the cage that's going to keep the rabbits out and have that shipped to your house? Can you go stick 4 stakes in the backyard so you know where the vegetable garden is going to be? Can you hire someone or find someone who will bring the dirt in that you need because your backyard dirt apparently isn't good enough to grow vegetables? And all of those things need to be accomplished. They never need to be accomplished, or almost never need to be accomplished in any specific order either. So you make a list and then you just start knocking those things off the list based upon the amount of time you do have, and suddenly you're growing vegetables in the backyard.
That's such a great example, right? Because it is like just break it down. And I think it's where we get overwhelmed, right? You're like, okay, I want to write a novel or I want to plant a garden. It's like, where do you begin? Well, you open up a Word document. It's like that's how you start. But
Yeah.
it's scary, I think it's overwhelming and people get overwhelmed, like paralyzed by the all the steps.
Right. Yeah. Well, if you see them, if you can sort of look at them and if you're a checkbox person and you put little squares next to them and you start checking those things off, things get a lot easier when you start breaking down tasks into small, easily achieved parts. Again, it's 1,000,000 tiny steps to achieve a goal, or 1,000 tiny steps to achieve a goal, but you got to start making some of those steps. And the more you make, the more you feel good about it. Like if you want to write a novel, when you get to page 10, you're going to look back and go, wow, I have 10 pages written. Like now suddenly you want to write the 11th page. Jerry Seinfeld had a great comment on this. Someone said, how do you write jokes every day, Jerry? How do you not skip a day? And he said, well, I put a calendar up on the wall and I wrote jokes on a day and I put an X on it. And then I wrote jokes the next day and I put an X on it. And pretty soon I had a chain of X's that I didn't want to ever break. So I just had that visual reminder of I've now written jokes for 630 days. Why would I skip a day? I've been writing blog posts every single day of my life since 2003. So why in the world would I ever wake up one morning and say to myself, this is going to be the one morning I'm not going to post something on the internet for my readers, right? That would be crazy. But it's that piling up of success and that momentum building that can really result in motivation for people who are lacking that motivation.
I'm impressed. Okay. Every day since 2003. I started a blog in '04 and I thought I was like super pioneer. You were like super, super pioneer.
Well, I started in college. I was taking a master's class and I had to take a class and I thought, well, blogging sounds easy and silly. And little did I know that, it's produced enormous and remarkable things for me over the years, just connecting with people I would have never connected with before, and also creating this wonderful sort of history of my life So
Mhm.
oftentimes when my wife and I are thinking like, when did we go on that trip? I said, well, I probably blogged about it. So I'll just go to my blog and search on, Washington, D.C., and we'll see when the last time we were in D.C. And inevitably, it almost always works, because a lot of times I'm blogging about sort of thoughts and opinions that are not necessarily tied to the specifics of a day. But, when big events happen or when my son says something crazy or my wife does something beautiful for me, it's going to pop up on my blog. And it's nice to be able to look back on your life and have that record because we lose our days so easily. We just forget them instead of holding on to them.
So easily. So do you blog in the morning or evening or in the margins of your day? And then do you have a content calendar or do you just sit down and go like, what am I inspired by this moment?
So I like that margins of the day. I always say I write in the cracks of the day, but the margins is good. It's more literary. Well, I post my blog every morning. What I really have is I have 100 and I'm looking here. I have 183 blog posts in some form or another ready to be tackled. So some are like done. Some are some evergreen posts that I wrote in the cracks of my day that I'm just waiting for the day when I don't have time one morning, like my son is throwing up and I need to post something. I've got those like five that are put aside that are ready to go, that my emergency posts. Some of them are just like I read something on the internet and I go, I can write about that someday. So I grab the link, I throw it into a blog post, and it's just a link and maybe a title that reminds me like, write about poison ivy. This link is interesting. And I'd go back to the link, I'd read about poison ivy and then probably write something about it. Some are half written. A lot of them are like written, but I can't find an ending to them. So I've just moved on from them. But when I wake up in the morning, what I usually do is I sit down and I look at I scroll through the 183. I don't usually get that far in, 20 or 30 in. I've gone, this is the one that feels like the right one today. This is the one that's grabbing me. So I give myself lots of optionality so that I'm never stuck with like the one thing I have to write before I head off to teach my 10-year-old. So, it takes half an hour. It's a good warm up for me before I start working on my novel. And it's a great way to connect with readers. So, yeah.
Well, I love this. I have never thought about I've always been like, oh, I've got an idea. Let me write it and post it. It's like, I just want to get it out there. Uh, and then over the years, I've been like, okay, maybe I should sit on it. And then I always tweak it, quite a bit. So I'm like, thank God I didn't put that out. And then, to think about you having 183 kind of half-baked ideas in the wings, waiting in the wings for your creative spark. That's a really, that's a really good idea.
Well, a lot of times I tell people that the best sort of writing or the best creativity, actually, I think comes with the intersection of two things. So, if I had read a interesting website about poison ivy, and I knew I wanted to write something about it, it's sitting there, and some posts sit there. I've had a post sit there for 12 years once. It's just something waiting for me to approach, and 12 years later I did. But if poison ivy is interesting to me for some reason, I'm usually waiting for something else to happen. Like I get poison ivy, and now I can talk about my life and the thing I learned on the website. Or my son gets poison ivy, and now I have that intersection with this. Or I'm battling poison ivy in my backyard suddenly, and I go, oh, there's actually a website with interesting stuff about poison ivy that I was looking to write about. Now I can bring these two ideas together. The other day I was writing about Domino's Pizza. Back in 2009, the CEO of Domino's declared that their pizza was terrible and acknowledged it and said we need to do better. And since then, it has been better. And Domino's Pizza, if you bought stock in Domino's Pizza in 2009, you would have bought it for about $9. And today it's worth $280, even after all the losses in the market, because they acknowledged their mistake. They put out commercials that talked about how terrible their pizza was. They had people come on and say, it's cardboard and ketchup. And he said, they're all right. We need to do better. And then they went and did better. And I knew I wanted to write about that, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. And then 3 years later, the website ProPublica released a list of all the credibly accused priests of the Catholic Church, who the Catholic Church will not acknowledge, are credibly accused and probably need to be handled in some way. And I thought to myself, they should just do what Domino's did, which is acknowledge their mistakes, make amends, and move on instead of like, this covering up that they're always doing. And suddenly I had two ideas. And so I wrote a post about Domino's Pizza and then how I would advise the Pope to treat his church like Domino's Pizza, which is transparency, acknowledgement, make enormous amends, correct the mistakes, do the same thing, for your church that Domino's did for pizza. And that post was so well received by people. I worried. I told my wife, I might like offend some of my Catholic friends by saying this. And all of them were like, no, you're right. We wish there was more transparency. We wish this problem was taken care of. If I didn't have Domino's pizza to combine with it, though, I'm not sure if it would have been received as well. So, I sit for 3 years on Domino's pizza. Something about the Catholic Church comes up. And again, the combination of ideas often yield the best results. So that's why you have to have a list of like stuff that I know I need to do something with someday, but I'm not quite sure what.
Yeah, so smart. I love that blending. And then do you share your blog posts? Do you take them like further into any publications or like Medium or?
Sometimes. So I write columns for magazines. And so a magazine, might require me to write a humor column I just wrote a humor column about autumn. And so the first thing I do when they say we want to write about autumn is I Google the word autumn in my own blog and see what over the last however many years, what have I written about autumn? Is anything amusing? Is anything insightful? So a lot of those will bubble up. I'm a storyteller as well. We're working on a product where people can learn storytelling online with me. And so my intern is actually scouring, my 2 decades of blogs for anything I've ever written about storytelling before, so we can pull that forward and make good use of it. So yeah, I'm a big believer. In Some Days Today, I talk about the importance of once you've created something, you need to sort of maximize its value as much as possible. So I wrote a book, but what else can that book be? Or I told a joke on stage. What can that joke become? Or I have a vegetable garden in my backyard. Now am I going to become a produce seller? Am I going to become a farmer's market person? Am I going to now learn how to make fantastic salads with the fruits and the vegetables I'm growing? Like, maximize the thing you're making. Because once you put something in the world that did not exist before, that's an extraordinary act. And I just believe it's worthy of as much celebration and frankly, as much profit as you can earn from the things that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So smart. And yeah, I really love all these examples. I think it's helpful to see, like, okay, how could I take this and bring this into the world? And what a fun blend with Domino's and the Catholic Church. Like, super well done. One of the things you talk about with productivity is social media. And I was really surprised to read that, okay, I can't imagine that's just 1 hour that Americans spend on social media, but I thought, is good. And then, but that turns into 15 days. And is that 15 days 24/7 or is that 15 like 12-hour days? I'm
That's
assuming.
15 24
Okay.
7 days. Yeah.
Yeah.
15 full midnight to midnight days that Americans spend on social media. And I agree, it's probably more now. So those statistics are probably getting just worse and worse, exacerbated by the pandemic as well. If you just think 10 years ago, social media really didn't exist in this country. It was very in its infancy. And so that means 10 years ago, everybody was doing something else instead of looking at their phones. And the thing that we were doing 10 years ago was probably valuable. It was probably talking with other human beings, walking, playing a sport, looking at flowers. It was probably things that were actually really helpful to us. And instead, we've supplanted it with this thing. And I'm not opposed to social media, it does extraordinary things for me. But for me, my social media platform is I put things out on social media and I walk away. You're not going to find me scrolling. You're not going to find me looking at my friends' pictures of their babies. You're not going to find me doing any of that really at all. I curate Twitter for news. So when I click on Twitter, if you ever see me on Twitter, I'm checking on the news of the day because I only follow those things that will provide me with the news sources that I want. You might see pictures of me and my family on Instagram, but once the picture's on Instagram, I walk away. I never see anything on Instagram. My wife will say things to me like, your cousin had a baby. And I'll be like, I didn't even know she was pregnant. And she said, you didn't see it on Facebook? And I said, I go to Facebook, I put my thing on Facebook, and then I walk away from Facebook. And that's how I live my life. And it's really been good for me. The 100-year-old version of me is never saying, I wish you had spent more time on Instagram. Like that would have been a good use of your life, right? That 100-year-old version of me says, stay off that stuff as much as you can because it's a terrible waste of time. I have a 13-year-old daughter who doesn't own a phone and everyone thinks I'm crazy. And if she was here right now, she's at school today. But she would tell you, I kind of wish I had a phone, but also I know my life is a lot easier because I see the drama that my friends go through because they have a phone and I don't have any of that drama.
Mhm.
And so even she at 13 can sort of recognize the fact that once she has to get one of those things in her hand, it changes your life if you don't have any discipline. And most of us don't have discipline.
No, no.
No.
And, it's just like the youth, as we call them, they're just like, oh, like this. I'm like, oh my gosh, like we were playing in streets. And, so it's just like such a different experience. And I think it's beautiful that your daughter doesn't because it is so addictive and it's just set up at a young age. And then, I don't know how you break that. I mean, we at least knew a world before it. And so I think we have a little bit more touch with reality about it. Not
Yeah.
that we're good, always,
Hmm.
but we still have, but for them, like they've never known any different, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's I know young people who have sort of found ways to step away. I actually think once you become aware of what it's doing to you, that is enough to step away. I think the problem is that so much of their lives become tied up into it that they can't imagine not being on it and with it all the time. You know, FOMO is a real thing,
Mhm.
and they fear that if they put this thing down, something's going to happen. And so often I tell people one of the best ways to handle these situations is you just say to yourself, will this matter next week?
Mhm.
So you're facing a problem, and it's the framing I always give to my kids and even my wife. In the book I talk about during the pandemic, we stocked our basement freezer with like hundreds of dollars of meat. I went and I just bought all the meat I could. I saw the pandemic coming because I had biotech clients who warned me in December of 2019 that it was coming. So I was stocked. And so we had hundreds of dollars of meat in the freezer to eat. And then one day my daughter went downstairs to get a popsicle and she did not close the freezer door. And we didn't go in the basement for 3 days. And so when I finally got back to the basement, I found the freezer door open and all the meat was spoiled. And when my wife came down, she was so upset, and rightfully so. And I looked at all this meat and I said, honey, in a week, will this matter to us? Or will we joke about the most expensive popsicle there ever was? Right. And she said, in a week, we won't care anymore. And I said, well, can we pretend that it's already that week and just clean this up and not allow this day to be ruined? Because if it's
Mhm.
not going to matter in a week, let's not make it matter today. And
Mhm.
so much of our decision making, if we frame it that way, if I tell someone, I know that if I take your phone from you for 6 hours, you won't be able to see what your friends are doing. But a week from now, will that actually matter to you?
Mhm.
It probably won't. I'm actually pretty sure it won't. So let's just experiment with that and pretend it's a week from now. And all the things that your friends have done today are now irrelevant because that's the truth of things. When people are looking for sort of likes and heart emojis and all the things they look for on these social media platforms to get good feelings, they think they're garnering something. All you have to do is say, like, a month later, you put something on Instagram. Do those hearts mean anything to you now? Do those
Mhm.
thumbs up emojis mean anything to you now? They meant something to you in the moment, but if they're not meaning something to you a month from now, is that a real meaning or is that some fleeting dopamine machine driven nonsense that you have to escape from? Once you get that awareness, I think you can step away a little easier, but the awareness is hard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great reminders. So my last question for you, Matt, is well, before I ask you my last question, is there anything else that you would like to share kind of about the book that you hope readers or listeners who are listening today will take away that we haven't touched on?
I guess, I'll mention sleep a little bit just because people always assume I don't sleep very much. And I do sleep less than most people. I sleep 5 to 6 hours a night. But what I like to tell people is I'm an efficient sleeper and most people are not. So when I go to bed, my wife could attest to this. I'm asleep within 1 minute. I am out. And I wake up without an alarm almost every day at 4:30. My eyes open and I'm fully refreshed and ready to go. And everyone, or almost everyone, can do this. Some people have legitimate sleep problems, but most sleep problems come from the fact that we don't treat sleep sacredly, which means the only thing you really should be doing in your bed is sleeping. If you're reading or watching television in bed, you're telling your mind and body, this is a place that we do a multitude of things. And it doesn't allow the body to be aware of what it's supposed to be doing. So when you get into bed and you want to sleep, your mind might be looking for TV or it might be looking for a book instead of there's only one thing we do here. So when you put your head on the pillow, my mind says, oh, it's time to go to bed. When you stabilize your bedtime, weekend and weekdays, the same time or about the same time every day, regardless of what's happening in your life, your body is created in such a way that it releases chemicals about 2 hours before you actually go to sleep that prepare you for sleep. But if your sleep time is shifting constantly, your body is not able to release chemicals that will promote the sleep. So every night I am asleep sometime between 10:30 and 11, maybe 11:15. But that's a zone where my body understands that around 9 o'clock, we got to start releasing those chemicals because he's going to be in bed in an hour and a half, right? So I'm preparing myself properly for sleep. And then like the snooze alarm, it's the worst thing. Just stop using it today. Your life will be better. Because what happens with a snooze alarm is you wake up, you hit the snooze alarm, which means you begin a second cycle of sleep. And then you startle yourself awake in the middle of that cycle or just in the beginning of that cycle, which is why so many people wake up still tired and feeling bleary-eyed, because rather than waking up normally and naturally, they startle themselves awake every morning, which is a terrible way. So even if the alarm goes off for me, my body has already begun the awakening process. So if I am startled awake by the alarm, it's okay because I'm practically awake already. I'm not in the middle of a REM cycle that has now been disturbed. And for the next 4 hours, I'm going to feel a little off, which is how most people start their day, is why they're pumping coffee into their bodies. I've never had a cup of coffee in my life. If you just do these things right, if you just do some simple sleep practices that promote it, you're just going to find yourself sleeping less, because rather than spending 8 hours in bed, of which probably 6 hours you actually spend sleeping and 2 hours you spend dithering around with nonsense, turn that 8 into 6 and suddenly your 24-hour day became a 26-hour day. Gaining 2 hours in a day, that is the biggest gift you could ever give yourself. So see if you can reduce the amount of time you sleep by sleeping more efficiently and treating it as sacredly as it deserves to be treated.
Beautiful. I love that. I'd love 2 more hours. And you're right. It's like before bed, it's like, what am I doing? Who cares? What am I even looking at? But I'm too tired to put it down. Isn't that insane?
Yeah, well, you're killing yourself too, because that blue light on a phone
Oh,
is actively hurting your opportunities to sleep. So you just have to treat it. There's a whole bunch of other things that I'm not talking about now that are in my book,
yeah.
and they're not hard. They're not even like, wow, that's going to really cause me problems. There's a lot of simple things like white noise and really simple things you can do, the temperature of your room and what kind of shower you're taking and when you're taking it during the day and adjusting temperatures based upon body's needs. All of those little things can turn you probably into a sleeper like me, which makes my wife crazy because she does all the things you're not supposed to do. But she's often in mid conversation with me. As we get into bed, she's talking to me and she says, you fell asleep in the middle of my sentence last night. And I said, because bed is for sleep. We were downstairs for 3 hours. You could have told me all that stuff in those 3 hours period. When my head is on the pillow within a minute, every single night I'm asleep, and it's a good way to live.
Yeah, that's impressive. It is.
It's not really impressive because it's not hard to accomplish.
Um, okay, sleep goals, hashtag sleep goals.
Yes.
So my last question for you, Matt, is the name of the podcast is Tranquility du Jour. So I'm curious, how do you find tranquility in your everyday? Because you do a lot and you have really great routines. So and that might be your tranquility, but I'm curious.
Well, I've done a lot of reading on sort of the things that are really great for our minds in terms of promoting, positive feelings and really stimulating the kinds of chemicals you want your brain to release. So I meditate in the morning, for example. That also is a great sleep that is right tied in with sleep. But I know that looking into a tree, lying underneath a tree and looking up into the branches and the leaves is great for your brain.
Mhm.
We're wired originally to be living in the trees, tens of thousands of years ago. And that still works for us. They've done all this brain research that says all you got to do is lie under a tree, look into the leaves, and you'll feel better. And so I do that every day. And I know that petting my cats, when you take care of an animal and you just physically touch that animal in a positive way, that is great for your brain. So rather than just sort of like walking by my cat and petting it, I say to myself, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to sit with Toby. He's going to be on my lap. He's going to purr. And all I'm going to do is give 10 minutes to my cat, and my cat's going to give 10 minutes to me. And I know at the end, I'm going to feel better for it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I find those small things, when you pile them up, incrementalism again, if I look into enough trees, if I make sure I take some walks, if I make sure I pet my cats, if I make sure I hold my wife's hand, if I make sure I squeeze my son, I think the problem is most people, again, want that magic pill. They want to just feel good right now. And so when I tell them, look into a tree for 10 minutes tomorrow and go on 3 walks and pet your cat and hold your spouse's hand and like hug your kid 4 times, they don't see that as like the instantaneous, I now feel better, result that they're looking for, because they don't believe that those little things accumulating over time are going to make you happy. But my wife often says I'm the only happy elementary school teacher in the country today, given the pandemic and the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, yeah.
I think she might be right.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell her, am I happy because like I'm a better teacher? Or am I happy because when I send my kids off to music class, the first thing I do is I go sit under a tree for 5 minutes and I spend time intentionally with the cats and I exercise every day, no matter what, even if that just means a walk. Am I happy because of the way I teach, or am I happy because I'm doing the very deliberate things, the very small, almost infinitesimal, but deliberate things that bring happiness to me? I always tell her it's the latter. She argues it's the former. But either way, I think we're probably both right a little bit, but I think that's how I find my tranquility.
Beautiful, beautiful. Great reminders. Matt, thank you so much. And thank you for putting out this beautiful book. I really, really love it. And yeah, and thanks for all the great tips. I'll be sure, listeners, to link to all his social and all that good stuff. So, but he will not be responding because he will not be looking for the likes or the hearts. But
Probably not, unless I'm in line at CVS.
yes.
That is the time when I will go, is anyone angry about what I wrote today? Those are the moments. Again, I've got 4 minutes. I can look and see if someone's mad at me, but otherwise,
Right.
You are correct.
Well, thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. So I hope you're as inspired as I am after this amazing interview. And if you would like to find our guest, there's a link to his book in the show notes, his Facebook, and his Twitter, and his YouTube channel. All right, so you can find all these over in the show notes, which again is kimberlywilson.com/593. Also, a gentle reminder, if you're not receiving love notes yet, please sign up for those. You get invites, inspiration, and more, and inside peeks also on all things Tranquility du Jour. There's a link to browse my 6 books and planner, and also a way to follow along on Instagram and YouTube. And then shop seasonless, vegan, locally made, eco-friendly fashion. TDJ by Kimberly, and I'm currently working on the spring collection, so if you have any requests, do share. And then finally, if you have a moment to share a review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts or any of my books on Amazon or Goodreads, would be so, so grateful. And I'd be happy to send you a thank you postcard. You can find more about this at kimberlywilson.com/review. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in. I wish you a delightful week ahead, and may it be filled with much tranquility.